Four-Way Review has partnered with writers to share a series of conversations on craft, exploring both the formation of specific scenes and the text as a whole. Salvatore Pane's The NEOREALIST in Winter is a collection of 11 short stories that explore what it means to be human in an age of media oversaturation. This collection explores a variety of bold themes: human connection, identity, and especially the Italian-American identity and experience, connections to place, generational trauma, and how humans interact with media. Pane grapples with the legacies of immigration, toxic masculinity, class conflict, and moral failures. His characters are humane, funny, and profane, and his stories are stylistically inventive.
In an interview with Litzberg, you talk about setting some of your work in Scranton, saying, quote, "I long for my idea of home, but I'm fully aware that the Scranton of my imagination doesn't exist. It's changed as much as I have, and I use that gap to power my fiction." Building on that answer, how would you say your personal experience has shaped this collection? And then how do you see, and this is a very big question, we know, how do you see your collection as potentially complicating assumptions or cliches presented in the media about Italian Americans?
I think every writer is completely impacted by their lives, and just the experiences of their lives and their childhood, especially. I think Flannery O'Connor said, by the time you were 12, you've experienced so much that you could just write dozens of novels based on those experiences, and I think that's exactly right. Even for writers who are, working in sci-fi or fantasy, I still think they're drawing directly from their lives, in large swaths of situations. So especially with characters, so that's the big thing for me, is that I'm never basing characters directly on people I know, but I'm drawing elements from people I know, and just people I've experienced. And maybe it's like, it's not like it's, oh, my best friend or something like that. It could be someone I met for a few hours and something they said has always stayed with me, and I just kind of lodged that in the back of my mind subconsciously as something that was compelling. An exercise I always give with my students is, if they're struggling with characterization, which I feel like often students are when they first come to creative writing, just like I did, and I probably still do, as all writers do. I ask them to take one person, and, take another person, and jam them together and try and make a character out of that. And then as you continue to write about them, they will take a life on their own, and they'll shed those kind of initial qualities that kind of drew you from reality into the fictional world. So for me, I'm drawing on all sorts of things. It's like my wife always jokes, like, I can never just have a hobby. Anything that I think is my hobby just immediately ends up in the fiction. So, if I start watching Goodfellas obsessively, it ends up in the fiction. If I start watching pro wrestling, it ends up in the fiction, and I think that's just how I'm wired, where my brain is just always constantly working through the media that I'm taking in, or really any experience that I'm taking in. About the Italian American question, I think it's really interesting. I think obviously Italian Americans have had it easier than the vast majority of groups that have stereotypes applied to them. So I always want to be really conscious of that. Sometimes I talk with Italian American groups and I can feel a little uncomfortable sometimes, because they'll have views that are really different than mine. They'll talk about like how important Columbus is, and my general thought is like, is it important? Maybe we should take them all down. I think that's probably what I would vote for. And I think Italian Americans are doing just fine. We don't need a Columbus statue, to signify how things have gone. But I do think that anytime you can point out cliches or stereotypes about a group of people, then it points that out for every group of people, in a way of just like, groups of people are not monoliths, and there's lots of nuances amid every type of identity group, or any type of, way you want to silo people. So I think even if we're kind of in a low stakes world of kind of picking at the stereotypes beneath Italian Americans, I still think it's doing work that, is necessary. And it's probably my best way in as a white writer. It's like, okay, well, how can I think about my own identity? And is that useful? And I'm not totally sure, but I probably think it is, and yeah, and I still kind of like those stories. Like, I love gangster stories and mobster stories and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of feel at war with my own interest, and also probably what in my gut I feel is right. But yeah, I mean, if it wasn't for The Godfather, I don't know if anyone would care about Italian Americans in media representation. And I love The Godfather, you know, so it's just a total contradiction, I think.
When you find yourself bringing in maybe something that started as a hobby into your writing, how do you end up balancing your knowledge with the audience's knowledge of that piece of media, that TV show, movie, whatever it might be, with an audience who might not have that or might not have that same passion?
Yeah, I think about this all the time because I think it can be done very, very poorly and in a way that doesn't add much to fiction and can be really gimmicky. You know, so my rule of thumb is if you're going to use pop culture, it has to be for characterization. That always has to be the motivation. You know, it can't be just, oh, it'd be cool to write a story where somebody, you know, is watching Mean Streets or something like that. That seems cool, but then that's really hollow, right? So it always has to be about characterization for me. So like the story in the collection about Goodfellas, that made sense to me because it's like I think a lot of people can relate to the idea, especially post lockdown, of being extremely depressed and just watching the same thing over and over, whether that's literally the same thing or if it's binging a TV show. You know, as you know, I'm just coming off of COVID right now, and I watched maybe 35 episodes of Lost, which I hadn't watched since the early aughts or when it came out. You know, my wife had never seen it, but it felt like really comforting to just go back of like, I don't have to learn anything. I know who the characters are. I don't have to decide what to watch when this is done. The next thing will just come. And I think that that is a very common kind of response to depression or anxiety. And with PTSD, it's very, very common that you want to watch something that you know exactly how it's going to play out because you don't like surprises. So for that story where the character's obsessed with Goodfellas and kind of his life's kind of falling apart, I chose Goodfellas really deliberately because it was something that I felt most people would have seen. And then if they haven't seen it, it's like, well, they're good fellas. They're mobsters. You know, it's like, it's not a high concept that needs a lot to be explained, you know? So it's like, yeah, this is about mobsters. Guess what? They go to jail. Most of them die. It doesn't turn out great. You know, we've all kind of know what that story is, but I wouldn't pick something maybe really obscure that I love, you know, because I don't think that that would work in that environment. And if I am going to pick something obscure like pro wrestling, or if there's another story in the collection about a fictionalized sitcom, I want to make sure I give everything the reader needs to latch on to that world in a way that doesn't kind of drown the fiction in a sea of meaningless details. So to sum it all up, it always has to be characterization. It's got to come out of the characters and not me and my own interests, you know, and that's the tightrope.
But then as a writer, if we think of like the collective whole of like the internet humanity, putting ourselves in these different small little tribes or groups, how, as a writer, do you end up creating stories that are going to appeal across those groups? Or is that something that, as you are crafting a story or a collection, you find yourself not being interested in or rejecting because you're going to find the right group for the right story?
I think probably a lot of writers would say, you know, like I would hope, and I would say this too, this is where I'm going is I would want to reach the largest amount of people, you know, as I guess this might be really naive or maybe like a symptom of my own like subject identity of thinking about this question, but like I think there can be maybe universal, like, okay, story, like not universal, but feelings almost everyone has had about like death, loss, love, and that is the kind of anchoring principle that I would try and explore, even if on the surface it seems hyper specific of a guy watching Goodfellas, but at the end of the day, it's like it's about a guy who lost a family member and can't deal with it and feels stuck in his like late 20s, early 30s career wise. And to me, that is something that probably a lot of people could latch onto. So I think that's how I'm always thinking about it. It's like, okay, the top level is kind of the specific thing, you know, the really kind of siloed piece. And then at the core has to be something that is more, again, not universal, because that's a dangerous slippery slope when we start talking about that or thinking about it, but at least something that people who have no idea about the surface thing could latch onto.
When you thought about putting the stories of the Neorealist in Winter together, what had been your hope in their organization?
The ordering came pretty quickly, which almost never happens. I feel like every single thing that you do as a writer takes 10,000 steps and is brutal and takes far longer than anyone would anticipate, and that's typically how I work. But something about the order was like once it clicked, it clicked. I cut some stuff out and some stories that I didn't think fit. But then once I locked in at this order, it felt like this was the correct order. And the publishers told me like, oh, normally we will rework the ordering with the writer, but we feel pretty good about the way you've sequenced the collection. So I wanted it to almost be circular in a way. So we start in Italy, but we're starting from an Italian American going to Italy. And I think there's a really thorny relationship between Italian Americans and the real Italy, and I've gone there a lot and I teach there and I take students there. And I generally think like Italian Americans think like we're going to the homeland and they can't wait to see us, and they imagine goats and fields and Godfather. And then they get there and like are shocked to discover like, oh my God, 150 years of progress have occurred since when the ancestors left on a boat in the 19th century, and they're all shocked to discover this. And generally, I feel like the European Italians, the real Italians, feel like, oh, we don't think about you at all. Like you don't even exist for us. We couldn't care less about what you're up to. And I think that's really interesting and something I like playing. So I wanted to start there, so the conflict between an Italian American and a more established European Italian and just the whole American European kind of divide. But then by the end of the collection, it's the one story from the point of view of a European Italian, and there are no Americans in the final story. So I thought that that would be a kind of interesting cycle to go through. And then in terms of sequencing, it's a lot of just like, I didn't want all the serious stories together. I didn't want the stories that have really bombastic kind of premises to be too close together. So it's just making sure that everything is like balanced in the right way, so that if a student or if a reader's feeling like I'm bouncing off of the collection, that hopefully the next story locks them in. So it's interesting talking to readers where it seems like people either love half of the stories or the other half of the stories, so I don't know what to do about that, as I've thought through that. But then in terms of editorial changes, I'm terrible at wanting to make edits constantly. So, I made hundreds of edits, like tiny line edits that probably don't change anything. Like I know I'm in the weeds when I change each and every back and forth like 3 times, and I just do it every draft. And finally, the editor, one of the editors at Autumn House, Mike Good, and all the editors there are wonderful, including Christine Stroud, who's great. But he took me aside. And he's like, "Look, we gotta put this book out. You can't make 100 new edits to these stories we've been looking at for months. You gotta let it go." And I that was the best advice I got, to be honest. And I think that's the advice all writers need. Otherwise, we tinker forever and just like, oh, let me just take one more crack at the line. So I'm glad he pulled me back from the edge. I'm always like the type of editor where I'm just cutting, so I've joked with my wife. I'm like, wouldn't it be great if I could just have a book with nothing? Like if I was able to finally get it down to 0 words, wouldn't that just be the platonic ideal of a book to turn over? Just like we finally cut all the fat out. It's just you start and you're done. So no. So I mean, there are stories that I thought would fit in a collection of stories that had been published, but I feel like stylistically I changed a lot. So the oldest story in the book is from 2014, and then the most recent is probably from 2023. And I think my style at the start was a lot jokier and sarcastic, and I wasn't ready to really dig in to the real emotions. So I started cutting most of those stories that I thought were too over the top. They didn't emotionally fit. There wasn't a clear connection to any like media or Italian American stuff. So I never wanted to put them back in. And no one saw this version. It was just, I just like put the sequence together and then looked at it and kind of started just drilling it down before I even sent out the manuscript. So the oldest story is Zeitgeist Comics. And then Last Train to Siena is the most recent story.
Do you, when you think then of those stories that didn't make the cut, does that give you a semblance of what that next collection or their next that next output might be if it is another collection of stories?
I don't think I'll collect them. I think, you know, they were all published in journals and they had their time. And I'm very much a type of writer where like if I feel like if I cut anything, that wasn't wasted time. I needed to write that to get to the thing that would be published and that matters for me. So no, I don't want to go back. You know, I just want to like keep going forward and building on this book. I'm working on a novel now, so I don't have another story collection inside of me right now, but obviously I love short stories. I read short story collections all the time, so I definitely want to do it again. But I think I need time to, because and especially with this collection, the one thing I really didn't want to do was have like the Sal Pane greatest hits. Here's all his best stories from the last 10 years, because I hate those collections. You know, I can think individual stories are great, but I find it very unfulfilling when you get to the end and like, what was this about? And I really wanted the collection to feel cohesive and about a similar idea, you know, that was getting cycled through a bunch of different ways. So I think it would take me a long time to have enough stories that were decent, get built to something.